Welcome to the Church Solutions Podcast, brought to you by JSL Solutions. The Church Solutions Podcast is designed to help equip you and your church in the use of technology and other tools and services. And now, here are your hosts, Steve Lacey and Phil Thompson.
Welcome to the Church Solutions Podcast.
Hi, I'm Steve Lacey.
And my name is Phil Thompson. It's great to have you here today. And a very quick recap here on what we do. We are JSL Solutions, and we work with churches that do streaming video, mobile apps, as well as websites, interactive websites, as well as church management tools. And Steve and I have been involved in church work for many, many years. Church, we've said this before, but you've been in leadership in various boards. I've been involved in leadership and actually pastoral ministry. In fact, I'm kind of a part-time pastor for a small church here in the Tucson area. And we talk a lot about different subjects, from tech-related subjects mostly, but we also talk about leadership things and ministry-oriented deals because we like that.
Right.
And that's what we do. And part of our vision is to help churches, help pastors, help volunteers. So it's not just about the tech world. And today is definitely no exception. Today we're going to talk about an issue that is not widely discussed, especially among churches. The last week or so it's been talked about more in the world, and that, of course, has to do with the death of Robin Williams, who committed suicide, who many people learned for the first time that he was battling depression and I think bipolar disorder. And the truth is, depression has really been a topic in the past that's kind of one of those things reserved for other people. But I can tell you firsthand that there are many people involved in ministry, pastors, leaders that suffer from depression.
Oh, yeah. And I've got people in my immediate or near family that, so I have some experience with it as well.
I think if we're all honest, we probably know somebody, or maybe you yourself deal with some depression issues. I actually have dealt with some depression issues, which I'll get into in a moment. But here's what I want to say first off, before we get into some of these things, is that if you're listening today and you feel like you might have an issue with depression, listen to us for a little while here, and maybe we can help you, give you some tips to maybe get some help. If you don't have a problem with depression, I'd still encourage you to listen, because there are people probably within your church, maybe even if you're not a pastor, maybe you're a volunteer or involved in some kind of ministry, your pastor might have depression. I know at least two pastors here in Tucson that deal with depression.
Right.
In fact, I know a third one who's recently retired, and he was very out and open about it. It's
a disease that doesn't discriminate. I mean, it's any age, any ethnicity, any background. It can affect you.
So I'd encourage you to stick around here a little bit. You might learn something, or at least we might remind you of something that maybe you can help your pastor, help somebody with your church in this area a little bit. So Steve, let's talk a little bit about this. We know it's a growing problem. There's been some things written, especially in the light of the Robin Williams situation. Let's talk about possible causes for depression.
All righty. So top of our list is spiritual warfare.
So spiritual warfare. Now, again, we realize we have lots of churches that work with our company, our ministry, so to speak, and there's a variety of different ideas, depending on what church you go to, depending on your background. What is spiritual warfare? I don't really want to get into that a whole lot, but there is, I think, an element out there, depending on your background, your belief system, that what you're trying to do, there's an opposition against you in ministry,
right?
And depending on, again, it's a touchy subject to talk about spiritual warfare.
The enemy doesn't want the pastors to succeed.
Right.
I mean, the enemy's on the other team, and they want to use everything within their power to try to strike down the pastor. And this depression could be another tool.
Yeah, exactly so. So spiritual warfare is something to keep in mind. We can talk a little bit about how to overcome some of that here in a few minutes. Another cause of depression?
Unrealistic expectations.
This is, I think, a big one. So for me, I struggled with some depression. I was a senior pastor for a while, a number of years ago, and I began to get burned out, and I began to struggle with some things. I wasn't even realizing I was dealing with depression. And by the way, as we talk about this subject today, depression, there's different types, I think, of depression. There's not just a one label fits everybody deal. In fact, I've struggled with some things recently, and I was very open to you about it, and you were very gracious about it. And I went and saw a doctor, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And my doctor felt like part of my problem was really not so much depression as it was anxiety-related issues. And so when we talk about depression, we're not talking about a one-size-fits-all deal. There can be different types and different causes and different ways to handle that.
Right, exactly.
So just keep that in mind as well here. But unrealistic expectations. So demands on people, on especially pastoral people, people in ministry, people, the expectations are very, very demanding and sometimes unrealistic.
Yeah, and a lot of times the pastor will put expectations on themselves as well.
Yeah.
They thought, oh, I'm going to start this ministry, and it's going to, me and Bill Hybels are going to be right up there at the top, and the real life hits you. The average church is only 75 people,
right?
And so there's a lot of expectations that are put on by both the congregation as well as the pastor themselves. They have a great vision, and sometimes it's not immediately realized.
Yeah, and I think I can deal with this a lot because I always have high expectations of whatever it is I'm doing. And when I helped start a church in Kansas years ago, I had huge expectations, and we had a measure of success. We also had issues that we struggled with. We actually had a church split. We actually had the usual stuff you get in church work. It's a very difficult. I don't have to tell you if you're involved listening to this podcast, it's a challenging thing to work in church.
Yeah, and all the fingers, point back to the pastor, no matter what's going on, whether it's good or bad. The pastor is ultimately responsible. And so there's a lot of pressure put on the pastor with, expectations of, excellence and growth and spiritual maturity and that sort of thing.
And, in the old days, you used to get you'd get a letter from somebody complaining, or if they really had the guts, they might call you or maybe, talk to you. I'm talking about a critic, somebody who didn't like the way you were running the church. But today, it's really expanded now with social media.
Right.
I mean, you can get, I'm on Facebook and I see all sorts of just nasty stuff out there.
Oh, it's really easy for people to be very critical and not very, kind in how they act as well.
Well, they can hide behind social media.
Yeah, they can hide behind it as well.
And so it gets even nastier if you're talking Twitter, if you're talking some other social media things. And so all this stuff begins to add up. And so when the pastor or the people involved in the church leadership feel like, oh, we want to do this and we see how well so-and-so church is doing. And, you get a lot of these guys that have these blogs that have just huge success stories.
Right. And one of the things in leadership is if you don't have a percentage of your people that are angry with you, you're not going anywhere. You're not leading. So if you are leading, you're going to have some detractors.
Yeah, you can't keep people happy all the time. You're always going to have people that are not happy with decisions you make.
Right, exactly. It's part of the job.
Yeah, and you just have to go forward with that. But again, when you getting bombarded, if you're involved in leadership, and again, maybe you're not a pastor, but you've got to keep an open ear to what we're talking about here, because your pastor or pastors, they're subject to this stuff, and it does, after a while, it grates on you.
Right.
You get tired and things. So unrealistic expectations are one. We mentioned spiritual warfare earlier. Another possible cause of dealing with depression is
failure to take time away from church.
Well, I tell you what, I'm a very driven person. I've tried to back down over the years, but especially when I went off and started this church, I did not take a Sunday off for 2.5 years. Now, I did take some time, a few days off during the week from time to time with my family, so we weren't totally idiots here. We did take some breaks for a few days. We are actually in Junction City, Kansas, a little town in Kansas by Fort Riley Army Base, and Kansas City wasn't about 2 hours away. So we would sometimes, back in those days, Priceline was kind of out there, so we could get a decent hotel for Priceline, go downtown Kansas City and enjoy ourselves. And we did do that. But I spoke every single Sunday for 2.5 years.
Yeah, and a lot of people may think, oh, that's a good thing, he's always there, he's always jumping in.
It
But
was
we need
not.
to take a healthy attitude about vacation. I mean, vacations need to be mandatory. They're not.
Yeah.
I mean, they're for the good of the church and for the good of the individual. Is they need to go and take a break and get away and get out of go visit another, go on a vacation and go sit in the pews in another church rather than being up
Right.
front.
And I knew that, Steve, and yet I didn't do it. I think part of the reason I didn't do it when I was a senior pastor was because, I was trying to grow this church. Part of it was survival. We're out here, we started with 4 families, and, if we don't make it, we're starving kind of a deal, which again, that's probably not even accurate either, because you've got to sometimes have a little faith and confidence and not freak out. But I just drove myself for 2.5 years and really even longer. But it's okay to not be in church for a couple weeks, take a vacation, have somebody else take the pulpit. And that was something that I didn't do, which I think down the road a ways led to me getting more burned out. And then the other thing too is, and while we're on this subject, we got some time here. After about 7 years of doing this and going through all sorts of things, for me, I actually had a possibility to come back to Tucson, which eventually I did take. But I did meet with some guys that I was working with. I was smart enough to have at least 2 or 3 guys that were involved in ministry from other churches and were older, and I could trust them. And I talked to them about what I was dealing with, and their suggestion was, why don't you just take a sabbatical? And my thought was, how am I going to do that? I mean, how long? Well, somebody said a year, and you don't have to take a year sabbatical. You can take maybe 6 months or even 3 months. But I basically rejected it. And now, if I had to go back to do it all over again, I mean, I'm happy with where I'm at now. We went through some stuff coming back here, but I mean, probably I should have taken their advice and taken some kind of a sabbatical. And again, some of you are listening going, well, how can you do that? And well, there's ways to do it. And one of the ways would be to talk about your leadership team, which we'll get into in a little bit.
You want to, if you're part of the leadership team, you need to, understand these things and recognize them and bring these issues forward.
Yeah.
And so that's one of them as well, is you want to plan for a sabbatical.
And again, I sitting in the seat of a pastor for years, I understand that when you go to talk to your leadership team that, hey, I'm having problems here, I'm feeling depressed, or something's not right, that makes you extremely vulnerable. And you're open to, well, there may be some people on your leadership team that aren't exactly crazy about some of the decisions you've made in the past. And so this could potentially give them, ammunition to whatever, get rid of you or do something. It's a risk. And that's what a lot of guys, why they don't talk about it. But the truth is, you've got to talk about it to somebody. And if you're not happy with your leadership team, or you're not comfortable with that, at least go to somebody that you can trust, maybe outside the church, and begin the process in that manner.
Right.
But again, you've got to step out and you've got to begin to do these things. Otherwise, it's not a good. The end result is not very good. So taking some time, if you don't take some time away from church, at least on a regular basis to some degree, you're setting yourself up for even worse situations.
All right. So next on our list, marriage and family problems.
Well, that can lead to depression and some other issues. If you're trying to lead a church, you're involved in leadership in a church, it's really challenging when you have some family issues, because again, there's this stigma of, well, I'm the pastor, I need to make it, I need to look like I've got everything together. Mm-hmm. And that's just not reality. I know, again, there's lots of different people from different churches listening to us, but the truth is we're all humans. Exactly. We all have issues. Our kids are not going to be these perfect little angels. There's these things about, well, if you just raise a child in the way they should go, they'll be perfect. And there's a little more to that scripture. It's been vastly, I think, misinterpreted, but we won't get into that. But family issues,
and
real.
The role of the pastor will also tend to compound these problems as well, and that you're focusing on your church family, and which pulls you away from your own family. So there's, it can become an issue where it's tied into not taking a break and just being so involved with your church that your family's going to suffer, which is going to lead to some problems within your own family.
Right.
So
It really does. And so you've got to have the courage here to, look at your family situation. And if it needs some extra time, you may need to take some time off and help your family. I mean, in my situation, my wife was having some extreme physical problems.
mm-hmm.
And in that, she actually has had some depression issues in the past. And so when you talk about physical issues on top of so maybe dealing with some depression, it makes matters worse. And so again, it's a handful if you're trying to lead a church.
And seeking out a Christian counselor is it's one thing you're going to recommend from the pulpit. You need to take that advice for yourself. I know the pastors I've served under have done that, and they're not ashamed of saying,
Right.
yeah, we met with Christian counselor for our wedding, for our marriage, and it's been very helpful. So
yeah, exactly. And that's part of the, you touched on it, Steve. There's a shame factor that we've just got to get over this. Because again, there's people in the congregation that go, no, he's haven't seen a counselor, but again, you've got to put you've got to put your family first. I mean, it's God and family and the church. And, I said that for years, but I didn't do it. Not because I was trying to be deceitful or anything. I believed in putting God, family, and church down the road a ways, but for some reason, church always popped up.
Sometimes
ahead.
the urgent overwhelms the important.
Yep, it really does.
Yes. So the next one is financial strains.
That's another one that could be a possible cause of depression and anxiety here. And again, if you're listening to this, if you're a pastor, hopefully, try to be honest with some of these things. If you're not a pastor, be sensitive to the pastor you have or the leadership team you have, because financial things are very stressful. It's stressful just in my life, period. And then when you're pastoring and you're dealing with your own income as well as the income of the church,
right,
challenging.
Yeah, and plus, pastors' income are not at the top of the pay scale typically.
Most of them are not.
So there's a strain there, and if the average church is only 75 individuals, there's going to be some financial challenges.
It's a tough issue, and again, a lot of people involved in pastoral work, they love people, they're all about people, but they're not always great when it comes to handling money or details, and that's a struggle because you're making money to some degree, may not be as much as you want or as much as you maybe need to have, and then you couple that with the fact that there's not a lot of skill set for some pastors in handling their money. They're not. It's just they're focused on other areas. They're not maybe gifted in that. You need to maybe, again, you talk about counselor. There are some people out there, financial counselors, that can help. And again, you've got to get over the stigma of, he can't even take care of his own household. Well, everybody has weak areas and weaknesses, so just get some help.
Right.
But it's not easy because you're dealing with all these other things. There's a thing out there that, you're the pastor, so you should, be able to do that. So, financial strains. So be sensitive to that, folks. And be sensitive to the struggles they have. So here's another one that's, I think, real big.
Oh, yeah. And this is comparing, or the problem of comparison, where you've got the church and there's a church down the street that's maybe doing better than your church. And or you socialize or get together or fellowship with other pastors, and you see you're inevitably going to come across some pastors that are doing much better in their ministry than you are.
Comparison is never a healthy thing, whether you're doing ministry comparison or job stuff or secular things. Comparison is not a good thing. And again, we touched on this a little earlier. With so much of the social media out there and all the stuff that, some of these successful guys are putting out, and a lot of it's good stuff, a lot of it's good material, there's a tendency to say, well, okay, I've got to be like these guys. Why can't we get to the level
How did they got to that level doing this? Why am I not getting to that level?
Yeah. And I've worked with pastors that struggle with that all the time. I mean, it's like, gosh, why is it working for them and not working for me? And we've, and being part of a pastoral team, we've struggled with that together, and we've even gone to conferences, and this is what this guy's doing, and it's working.
Right.
Seems to be working.
Right. So this contribute to your depression as well, especially if you go, well, why are they doing so much better than me? He goes, well, it must be me.
Right.
I must have some problem that,
And it may not be you at all. The truth is, it's a different circumstance. It could be you're in a different part of the country. There's all many different factors why some stuff works for some guys in different parts of the world, and other stuff doesn't seem to work.
Right.
For what we're trying to do. And there's just so many different factors involved. And so yeah, it's a struggle out there. And then so the other problem, I don't have this. I printed up some notes here real quick the other day, but one of the things is when you're dealing with depression and anxiety things, some of it could simply be physiological stuff that you're dealing with. I mean, it may not be a lot of these factors we talked about at all. It could be you've got a chemical imbalance.
Oh yeah.
And this is where the more controversy here, as we're talking about it, is medication many times can help.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But again, we're dealing with a stigma of, well, if I take meds, I'm weak, or if somebody finds out about this, it's still a stigma today.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can attest to this as well. I mean, we're gonna roll into, these are some of the causes, and that's definitely one of the causes. You can have a chemical imbalance. I know that some people very close to me have gone through this, and after seeking help and getting medication, they're completely great. So completely on,
or at least improved. Some medications are a struggle because, as we mentioned earlier, it's not a one-size-fits-all deal. And so I've been on different medications, nothing major, but
oh yeah, that's true.
I've done Prozac. I know pastors on Prozac or something like that. There's variations of that. I'm actually on a medication now, which is not so much for depression as it is more of an anxiety thing, which I think has helped me. But when you talk about medication, there are side effects. Which, and I remember years ago, before I was even dealing with a lot of this stuff personally, I would work with people that were on medication, and they'd get off their medication. They'd stop taking it. And sometimes they feel like, well, God healed me, or whatever. But then eventually the problem would resurface again. Well, why are you off your medication? Well, I don't like the side effects. And there are side effects to some medications.
Oh, yeah.
So you've got to try to find one. This is the frustrating thing for somebody dealing with depression, anxiety. The frustration is, what is it I can do to get better, and what kind of medication has the least amount of side effects, or at least seems to help me. And sometimes you have to try 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah, it may take a while. So we're getting into the, how to use seeking help and offering some solutions here.
Right.
But the first one is that you want to seek some medical help, and it may take some time. I know, just based on my experience with people very close to me, it's not, it isn't a black and white situation where they say, oh, you've got this, you take this and you're fine. I've got a headache, I take an aspirin, I'm good. So you may go through you're working with your doctor, experiment through some, different medications and what's going to work and what isn't going to work.
I'll just give you a quick example. When I was back in Kansas, I was going through a lot of stress and kind of a burnout, and I actually went to a psychiatrist who I really liked, and he prescribed something to me, and it actually made it worse. I got worse. I actually started feeling kind of suicidal. I wasn't exactly going to get aggressive with it, but I just kind of thought, life would just be so much better if I just didn't live anymore. It was kind of more as a passive suicidal thought. And so I told him about that. He says, okay, we get you off this. We're going to try something else. And I realize people listening to this thing may be totally against medication. And if that's your feelings on it, then fine. But I would encourage you to keep an open mind to it, because I did find some stuff that's kind of helped me a little bit. And I most of the time I'm doing pretty well. A lot of my issues are circumstantial, but again, some physiological stuff has nothing to do necessarily with circumstances. It's just you have a chemical imbalance.
Right.
So seeing a
And
medical
this is,
doctor.
yeah, and this is some really serious stuff as
It
well.
is.
I mean, as I was telling you before we started recording, I've got a nephew that at 24, 25 years old committed suicide. So he's suffering from depression and didn't seek the help that he needed. And I've just got a new member of our family that has someone close in their family that committed suicide just a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
So very recent. So this is a very serious thing,
Right.
and you don't want to take it lightly. You want to make sure that they're seeking medical advice and getting a doctor's input on this.
Yeah. So it's very important to do that. So seeking some medical attention, and it could start maybe seeing a good counselor. And again, there's good Christian counselors out there. I don't necessarily think you have to see a Christian counselor per se, but somebody that's very sensitive to this issue and either can point you in the right direction. Most counselors can't prescribe meds, but they can, a psychiatrist can or a medical doctor can. And so, I like I told you earlier in this podcast, I was going through some things a few months ago, and I went and saw my doctor, and it did help.
Right.
I'm glad I did that. So it was a tendency not to, but I decided I should.
So under the seeking help and offering solutions, number one is get to your doctor and or to a counselor.
Right.
The next would be that our pastors need our prayer and support.
Yeah. It's you know what, that helps a lot when you know that there are people praying for you. And again, if you're a pastor and you're dealing with this, I'm not saying you have to broadcast it to the entire congregation. I'm not saying that. But you might, let some people that are, you trust know about this. And, prayer and support really means a lot, especially when you know somebody's praying for you, somebody cares. There's the emotional support can go a long way.
Right, exactly. And this is a given no matter what, no matter what's going on. You want to pray for the leadership within your church.
Right.
And, and within your country and as well,
Yeah.
but especially for the leadership within your church.
Yeah. Because
no matter what's going on.
They're under a lot of pressure. And then speaking about this, as somebody involved in ministry, whether you're a pastor or volunteer or whatever, really make sure that you have set aside some quiet time. Again, I just would encourage you to do it every day. I mean, there was a survey out recently, a study that said most pastors don't pray, or most of them don't pray very much. And it's not that we don't believe in prayer. It's just that, again, we're so busy chasing our tails that we try to pray, but it kind of gets on a back burner, especially if you're real driven, so you've got to schedule some time. And I talked about this in a podcast when you were on vacation, about really spending some time to de-stress and setting up something in your day every day where you have a little bit of time of prayer, meditation, scripture reading, where you can kind of de-stress for a little bit. Decompress, de-stress. And kind of, it's a stress buster, I think I called it on one of the podcasts we've got here. So, yeah,
that was actually an incentive for an app idea you were talking about as well.
Yeah, I've got an app idea for that. We may develop it. I don't know. So, yeah, prayer support's encouraging, spending some time to pray. And we touched on this earlier, Steve. We're about out of time here. Make sure your pastor gets some time off every year. If you're a pastor, make sure you figure out a way to initiate that. And if you're on a leadership team, really encourage
hold
your
them
pastor.
accountable to adhere to the mandatory vacation time away thing.
Exactly. And we're almost out of time. We talked about how financial pressures can be very difficult on a pastor. If you're on a leadership team, really kind of make sure your pastor is being taken care of,
right,
financially. And if you don't have the extra money, maybe you can do some other things that would help with your pastor and his family. So we're out of time here. Check us out on iTunes. We're on iTunes under Church Solutions Podcast. You can give us a review. That would be wonderful. We'd love to hear your feedback even on this topic. Tell us what you think about it. Maybe you can add to it. Maybe you feel like, you're off the wall on this one. We'd love to hear from you. So let us know. And if you've got some issues with depression, or maybe you think you might, or you know somebody that might, and they need some help, we can hopefully point you in the right direction. Just send us an email, support@streamingchurch.tv. So we're out of time. Steve, thanks for spending some time with me today and with our audience talking about this sensitive subject.
It was great being here.
All right, folks, you guys have yourself a great day. We will catch you next time on another edition of Church Solutions Podcast.